There he is.
Hello. Hello. How are
Hello.
you
Hello.
today?
Good, good. So David, I want to welcome everybody to another lunch with Jamie. I didn't expect this to be as timely a conversation as it is now. The world was introduced to David Hogg after the horrific tragedy and shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, when he became a strong advocate for gun control and founded March for Our Lives. That's where I actually originally met David, when I produced a documentary, Us Kids. That was just really the beginning of his work and his activism, his political work. He's now the founder of the PAC Leaders We Deserve, and at 25 has recently become the youngest vice chair in the history of the DNC. As most of us know, David's been making a lot of waves in the news recently in regards to that new election and his some of his announcements. And he recently was on Bill Maher. Many of us saw him in the fiery debate he had with James Carville, a featured Lunch with Jamie guest most recently. And David, I just want to welcome you to Lunch with Jamie.
Thank you for having me. I am on the East Coast right now in DC. So my lunch is a linner of a sparkling water.
There
So
you go. Before we get into this conversation, and I know you live out of a suitcase at this point and no longer have really a hometown. I am curious, since it is called Lunch with Jamie, what three of your favorite restaurants or meals are today, and you can even include a fast food restaurant if that's really at the top of your list. Considering, in my opinion, McDonald's still reigns as one of the top restaurants in the world.
okay. So I would say probably one of my favorite meals is it would be a combination of two things from two different states. It'd be a combination of Pinocchio's Pizza from right in Harvard Square, with a glass of Spotted Cow beer from Wisconsin that is exclusively sold in Wisconsin that I came across in the 9 days that I was living out there last election cycle, knocking doors in a congressional election where I was simultaneously living out of a Days Inn while I was out there knocking doors across rural Western Wisconsin. And what are some of my other favorite meals? I would say the caprese salad and sun-dried tomato pasta my mom made growing up. It's kind of like my version of ratatouille, if you guys have watched the movie, except I'm not a food critic. And then I would say as well, probably the pancakes that my dad made for my sister and I every weekend growing up, despite the fact that he had such a grueling and tiring job being one of the lead FBI agents for LAX. He still managed to get up almost every single weekend and make my sister and I pancakes.
Wow.
So, yeah.
That's really sweet and a great mix of meals there. And I'm partial to Holiday Inn Express, where I've also lived at a Holiday Inn and a Days Inn as well from my fabulous movies. All right, those are going to be the toughest questions of the day. So now we're going to start getting into the easy stuff. Um, listen, it's pretty clear there's a lot of news going on related to you, and I'd love just to get a little table setting from you of sort of where this is all coming from, where things kind of stand in your mind today, and where you kind of see things going.
Okay. Well, I hope you guys are excited to learn about some parliamentary procedure and bureaucracy at the DNC, because that is what a lot of this revolves around. Um, so two things have happened. Right after the election, there was the way that the DNC elections work is that there are about 450 members of the DNC. And when there is not a Democratic nominee for president, those members really come together and vote for what are called the vice chairs of the DNC, the treasurer, some of the other officers of the DNC, including the chair. And there are several at-large vice chair positions that people can run for. There's actually three of them. And there is a gender balance rule. And the way that this election works is that there are multiple ballots, and it just happens so that whoever are the first three people to get a majority of the vote end up getting elected as the officers of the DNC. And there has to be a gender balance rule here. And during this election, on the final round of the ballot that myself and Vice Chair Malcolm Kenyatta won on, there is a dispute over how the final vote was counted because there was a rule change made that made it so that people could vote for one man and one person of any gender. The argument that has been put in front of the DNC is that this gave an unfair advantage to the men in the race because people were able to vote for 2 men, but they could only vote for 1 woman in the race, effectively giving the men access to 800 votes. At least that is the argument. And the women had access to about 400. And that put us the men at a unfair, the women at a disadvantage and the men at an unfair advantage. And what happened is there was a complaint that was filed with the DNC's Rules and Bylaws Committee regarding how this election was conducted, with the argument that I just made. As that argument was being processed by the Rules and Bylaws Committee and being heard, and there were all kinds of data being collected and everything like that. Just about a few weeks ago, I announced, unrelated to this, an effort to challenge I announced an effort to challenge Democratic incumbents in some of their safer seats for U.S. Congress, because I feel like right now there are far too many people that are asleep at the wheel that are failing to meet the moment in our party, in our safer seats, that have gotten a bit too comfortable, in my opinion. And we need to shake things up when our country is in a moment of crisis, where despite the fact that we're seeing Donald Trump destroy so much of the economy, despite the fact that we're seeing him accept jumbo jets from foreign governments and trade his cryptocurrency publicly, and probably, in my view, letting foreign governments purchase that cryptocurrency in order to essentially bribe him, we still see Democrats with a horrible approval rating right now. And this effort obviously has ruffled some feathers. We're not only focused, and this is with my organization, Leaders We Deserve, that I'm doing this with. It's an organization that's like Emily's List for young Democrats running for state legislature and Congress. There was a lot of misreporting in the headlines that came out around this, because we are not only focused on challenging incumbent Democrats. That would be dumb. We are also focused on defeating Republicans, of course, in critical seats that we need to break Republican majorities in state legislatures, and gain back the House for Democrats around the country, because we believe that we need to do 2 things at once. We need to address the horrible approval rating that our party has right now and safely handle a lot of the divisions that are going on in our safer districts that in no way, shape, or form risk us losing the House. And we need to support candidates that are running in critical frontline races, especially younger people, because that's who Leaders We Deserve supports, that are running in critical races around the country, so that not only can we defeat Republicans by talking about how awful they are, but we can defeat them by talking about how great Democrats are, because of our positive vision for the future of this country that is much more than just saying that we are against Donald Trump, but talking about how are we addressing the cost of living crisis, how are we addressing gun violence, how are we addressing so many other important issues that Democrats are great on. And there, simultaneously, in combination with this complaint about the election, there was another issue that came up where our chair, Ken Martin, wants to introduce a rule to the bylaws that say that officers of the DNC, like I am, as a volunteer role, by the way, this is an entirely volunteer role as a vice chair. I'm not paid to be part of it. It is entirely a labor of love. They want to introduce a rule that says that officers of the DNC cannot be involved or endorsed in primaries in their personal or official DNC capacities. What this would mean is that I have to make a decision between essentially being part of my organization, which is my full-time job, leading Leaders We Deserve, helping to elect young Democrats around the country, or my position at the DNC. The issue that comes up with this is that former vice chairs have endorsed in primaries and also had PACs that have given in primary races previously. So there is precedent for what I'm doing, and I'm not currently violating any of the bylaws as they stand. And I understand philosophically with what they're trying to do here in terms of having neutrality, but the reality is the DCCC that helps our congressional elections, the DS, the DGA, the DLGA, all these other committees, they do get involved in primaries, and they have a long history of doing so. And my view of it is that when I ran for this position, I talked openly about how I work to elect young Democrats, and that includes working in primaries and in general elections. I wasn't breaking the bylaws. I still am not breaking the bylaws as they stand right now. And I think it's wrong to change the rules of an election after the election that then can result in my removal. And the final thing that I'll say, final update with this, I'm sorry that there are these 2 parallel tracks that are a little confusing. Yesterday, there was a meeting to hear out the people that were contesting the results of the election. That resulted in that committee putting forward a resolution to the full body of the DNC to say, it is up to you all whether or not we believe our recommendation is that we need to have another election for the 2 final vice chair positions. That includes myself and Malcolm Kenyatta's. And now it is up to the full body of the DNC to decide whether that happens and how that happens, whether it is an electronic vote that happens in the next month or so, or if it is a in-person vote that happens at our next August meeting.
Thank you for that. And you and I have had a few conversations, and to me, that all makes a lot of sense and it's very clear. I mean, it's actually a great example of the media kind of overhyping something that's really pretty straightforward. That being said, I know Malcolm Kenyatta came out with a video this morning, expressing his frustrations and talking about how he thinks you're kind of shifting the narrative about the DNC. What have you talked to Malcolm, and what's your sort of response and his claims?
Look, there are disagreements that we can have. I don't take anything that Vice Chair Kenyatta says personally by any means. I feel like, the election was conducted in a way that was within the rules of the DNC, that it was allowed to be conducted that way. And I have talked briefly to Malcolm. We've texted a little bit, but there hasn't been that much of a conversation that's gone on. My view of it is that I personally feel like part of what is happening here is this is a way, just so you all understand, if they wanted to officially remove me as an officer, they would need a 2/3 vote of the entire DNC membership to do that. And that is obviously going to be harder to get than a simple majority. And I believe that even though this complaint had gone on previously to my work on primary efforts, I still believe that this serves an effective role of removing me, most likely, because it only would require somebody getting a majority in order to defeat me in that role. And of course, there's disagreement about that. And that is kind of where things stand. I think this is an easier way for them to remove me without needing to go through the hassle of getting 2/3 of the votes, in my opinion.
Got it. I mean, it does seem like there was, and I don't want to spend all day on this topic, but it does seem like there were questions about the vote on that day, and that it may have not been exactly up to the sort of traditional standards or rules or however you want to express it, right? I mean, that is fair to say, correct?
So what I would say is that a lot of the debate that happened on the committee call that happened yesterday was about Robert's Rules of Order. But the DNC's charter and bylaws supersede the Robert's Rules of Order. It's kind of like, the way that the Constitution, supersedes any state legislative or state law, for example. And as a result, the election was held within the rules of the DNC, even if it was in violation, as some are arguing, of Robert's Rules of Order. And part of the issue that's coming up here is that if we were to have this election again, there are several dozen members of the DNC. There are over a dozen members of the DNC who are no longer members of the DNC, that are no longer members of that electorate, that would effectively be disenfranchised from making their voice heard if they have this election again. And that's part of what's going on, but ultimately that's up to the DNC and whether or not they want to have that election again. Personally, what I think we need to focus on more is what are we doing? What are we doing to defeat Donald Trump and provide an alternative vision for the future of our party? Because I don't think voters in a swing state are thinking, well, who are the vice chairs necessarily of the DNC? To be honest with you, I think they're focused a lot more on, why are my prices going up? What is Donald Trump doing? Why is he taking a private jet from the government of Qatar and other things like that? But look, ultimately, if this is something that the DNC wants to do, it is their prerogative and decision to do that in the first place. And ultimately, in the role, the rules that are made around the DNC and the way that these elections are run, that's done by the DNC. I was just there as a candidate.
Yeah. We don't think everybody's waking up saying, who are the vice chairs of the DNC? Come on, David. We're all political wonks here. That's all we're thinking about. Okay, so now I have to ask the obvious question. You've been doing great work with Leaders We Deserve. You are one of the, really important young voices in the Democratic Party. Why are you still a vice chair? Why haven't you just said, I'll step aside? Why haven't you said, what's the benefit of now being in the DNC in your mind?
In my view, it's one, I'm not breaking any of the bylaws as they stand. And there's precedent for people doing basically exactly what I am doing right now, of people who have been vice chairs previously. And frankly, what I really worry about is that in the future, let's say that they get these rules changed and they say, all right, if you were an officer of the DNC, you cannot be involved in any way, shape, or form in primaries at any level for any reason at all. What I worry about is a double standard being created here. Because the president, the Democratic nominee for president, historically, they get to appoint officers of the DNC like vice chairs. So, for example, Gretchen Whitmer is a former vice chair. Tammy Duckworth is a former vice chair. These Democratic presidents come along and appoint these members of Congress and governors to be vice chairs of the DNC. They are often people who have what are called leadership PACs, where they raise money in order to help give it to their friends and allies in order to exert influence. And this is often to Democratic incumbents who may or may not have contested primaries. And what I don't believe is going to happen is I don't believe that the DNC is going to go to the next president and the next Democratic nominee for president and say, I'm sorry, ma'am or sir, that you appointed this member of congressman or congresswoman so-and-so to this position because they have a leadership PAC and they can't serve there because, they have that PAC. And now we're going to have to remove your friend from being an officer of the DNC. I just do not believe that is going to happen. And what I worry about is a double standard being created here where we're able to selectively remove people that don't agree with the establishment from the DNC. That is my bigger concern, and that's why I remain in this position.
This may sound kind of silly, but what is ultimately the number one role of the DNC? I think that's something that people are really confused by and really don't have an answer to.
Well, that's a really important question. There are a lot more things that we don't do than we do, and there's a lot of frustration that people have with assuming what the party should be doing. And in my, not in my view, but what the DNC does is pretty simple. One, we are the campaign in waiting for the Democratic nominee for president. We help to raise money for that. Two, we help write the party's platform. Three, we help manage the primary calendar of the Democratic presidential primary and the debate schedule. And we also help to fund state parties and democratically affiliated groups around the country to support the overall democratic infrastructure. That's really what we do. It doesn't go much beyond that. And sometimes, in midterms, it can look like getting involved in helping, for example, helping groups like the DCCC or the DS. And part of the issue that I have with this as well is that if we are supporting those committees, they are known to get involved in primaries and help behind the scenes in races. So my question is, even if if I'm not in this position because you can't be involved in primaries anymore, are we still going to support the committees that do get involved in primaries? Because I think that still creates a problem in the first place. But those are really the main roles of the DNC. And there's a lot of people who come to me, for example, that say, there have been people that have come to me that said, like, well, what does the DNC think about X, Y, or Z foreign policy issue? And I said, you don't want the DNC to be deciding the foreign policy of the United States of America. You want the president to be deciding that. Trust me. And a lot of the time, half of our job being vice chairs or our volunteer role as vice chairs is explaining what the DNC doesn't do. And frankly, a lot of the times why you actually do not want the DNC to be doing that thing.
Right. Yeah. I appreciate that. You've had a very complicated path to getting here. You've gone through a lot. You've experienced a lot of loss personally with your father, and I know which is a very big impact in your life. And then obviously, being a student at Marjory Stoneman Douglas. And since I've known you a little bit and then a little bit more recently, your perspective on life, which makes sense, has changed. And when I say life, I mean politics and related more to the establishment and the way things go has changed pretty dramatically. And I think I've actually, to be honest, been really impressed with this fact of seeing you as a young activist experience this horrific trauma where you just went out and you kind of wanted to kind of burn the system down, and you wanted to kind of really and nobody who was kind of the older generation really in your mind was doing their job. That David Hogg versus today's David Hogg is radically different, and I have to say it's really impressive. And I think many people I think sort of misjudge you because they sort of still just think of that guy. And when you talk about some of the older members in government today, I think the first instinct people would have is just like, oh, you just believe everybody who's been in government for a long time needs to go.
No.
And that couldn't be further from the truth. So will you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, Jamie, part of that comes with going to college and looking at the governments where people did vote everybody out. And let me tell you, it doesn't turn out well. because people don't know how the fuck to do their job, frankly. They really don't. Like, there's a reason why the way that the founders set things up, where we have, the House up for re-election every 2 years, but the Senate, only 1/3 of the Senate every 2 years at the same time, is a good way of doing things, because people get very sporadic, and we need to be sure to implement these changes gradually so that we're not just voting everybody out entirely and saying screw the entire system, because the reason why we have the issues that we have today is because of a set of incentives that are there that make people who they are. And unfortunately as well, I can tell you from my own experience working with younger candidates, it is not as simple as saying, if you're above, it's not like you get above a certain age and you start sucking. Unfortunately, it is not that simple. There are young people who suck, there are old people who suck, and vice versa. It is much more nuanced than just to say we need to only have a government of 30-year-olds by it. And that is not what I'm advocating for at all. What does concern me is the fact that we have raised a generation telling them, you need to go to college and then you'll be fine. And then you can have a good paying job, you can have a family, you can have a home, and your life will be set. And our generation, for the most part, has listened to what we've been told growing up. We have some of the lowest rates of teen pregnancy, some of the lowest rates of alcoholism, some of the highest rates of political participation and voting, some of the highest rates of education. And yet we find ourselves graduating into a world where we are suffocated in debt, where we are witnessing our schools around the country go through school shootings, and young people go through instances of gun violence outside of school as well. And even if we do graduate college, we then find ourselves struggling to afford a home. We find ourselves sandwiched with the crippling cost of elder care, right? Where, like I've told you, Jamie, the cost of care for my dad in the final month of his life, despite being a retired U.S. Navy helicopter pilot with full VA benefits and a medically retired FBI agent, his cost of at-home care for 12 hours a day was $19,000 a month. And the only reason why my family did not go bankrupt, and I had to make a spreadsheet to figure out how long we could afford to keep my father alive. The only reason we didn't go bankrupt is because he didn't live long enough for that to happen. And our party's message cannot be just to say we need to defend democracy over and over and over and over and over again, when this same system is what has put these young people through this so far. What we need to show is how are we using democracy to actually combat the special interests that have broken so many elements of the American dream, and what are we doing to actually make it achievable again? Not saying that we're going to make everything free, but just ensuring that our generation has the same chance that previous generations had, that if you worked hard enough, you could afford a home, that if you got good enough grades that you could go to college and not graduate with a lifetime of debt, and that going to the doctor didn't mean that you're gonna face years and years of medical debt for a condition that you had no control over having in the first place. And my evolution with this is that I know from my work on gun violence after Parkland with my classmates, as you know, Jamie, people told us you can't talk about the NRA in the establishment. They said you can't talk about the NRA, they're too powerful. You can't talk about banning assault weapons because it's too unpopular. But we did the exact opposite of that because we knew what we were fighting for, and we actually showed people that we didn't need to be afraid to say what we actually believed in. And because we led boldly like that, guess what? We actually got Republicans on the defense. In our Republican trifecta of a state, we raised the age to buy a gun to 21, and we passed a red flag law. And if we listen to those same idiot consultants, pollsters, and pundits that brought our party to this place, I wouldn't be talking to you right now, because we would have never changed anything after Parkland, because they believe in a politics of cowardice and complacency and just doing the same shit over and over and over and over again that has brought our party to this place. And what we're trying to do with this, and what I know from that work, what my generation knows from the work of millions of young people marching out of their schools, marching for their lives, and getting change on gun laws, is that, frankly, the only good politician is a scared politician that is afraid of losing their job. And I think it's time that we light a fire under everybody's ass, because comfortability in a crisis is not an option when our country is going through what it is right now.
I think that's so well said, and I couldn't agree more with you. The thing that confuses me is why the DNC hasn't, on its own right, figured out a way to really do what you're saying. Because ultimately, if we create a system where we only support Democratic candidates who have been elected already and just kind of are stuck in those roles and just kind of check those boxes off, then how are we ever going to raise another crop of amazing representatives? And I've heard you use the term asleep at the wheel a lot, which I think is accurate. By the way, and people, you use the term comfortable a second ago, and I think ultimately people in life just need to be uncomfortable, right? We need to live in a place of being uncomfortable if we want to achieve the ultimate success, and that's personally and professionally. And if you're just a Democrat who's been or Republican who's been in office for a period of time and just knows when to get reelected, why do you really care? Why are you getting out of bed? Why are you, you can pretend like, oh, it's just this continual fire of, doing your best, but ultimately that you need the pressure. And I don't even know, honestly, after thinking about this as much as I have and hearing what you have to say, what the other option is. I mean, we have to in comfortable seats where there isn't the risk of losing to a Republican. That's our farm system. Well, otherwise, what is the farm system in your opinion? Like, what do they think the farm system is now? Just sort of like lower state races, or what is the farm system right now?
Well, I mean, I think what really concerns me as well is that, guys, we lost vote share with every single demographic except predominantly older people and the highly educated last election cycle. And despite what Donald Trump has done, we still have an approval rating in the lower 20s right now. And when I got on with James Carville and we had our debate, I asked him, I said, James, I have an enormous amount of respect for what you've done. Getting, Bill Clinton elected is no small feat, and that is incredibly impressive. But my question to you is, now that we're 30 years on from that, now that we have social media and the internet, and that is where these elections are being decided, what is your solution to address it? What is your answer to addressing our 27% approval rating, or our 25 or whatever it is at this point percent approval rating? And what he said is to win elections. And to me, that's not an answer. And James eventually came around and called me, and he ended up saying that I actually agree with David, and he should not be removed from the DNC because he's a fighter. But that's part of what we need to do in our party, is understand that for the people that don't agree with me, I don't take it personally. This is a strategic disagreement, but we don't have an option of not having this conversation, because sometimes it is not a matter of your messaging. Democrats have said for the past 15 years, it's our message. It's our message that's the problem. It's our message that's the problem. Sometimes it's a messenger problem that we have ultimately. And I think part of what is happening, frankly, is that there is an uncomfortable conversation of reality and choice that our party has to make. Do we want to continue having the same people that brought us here continue to lead us and continue to fail us? Or do we want to change? Because the establishment wants to do two things at once, Jamie, that are not possible. They want to keep all the same players in their positions of power, and they want to win elections again. But relying on the same people that brought us here is not what's going to get us out of here. And frankly, if there are people that are made uncomfortable by us saying, well, we're going to challenge people that we feel like are not being effective, the answer to that is not to fight against us. It's to figure out how you can become more effective, right? If this is giving you anxiety, if you're a member of Congress listening to this, you should ask yourself why. Because somebody who is effective doesn't have anything to worry about. And all we're trying to do here is give people options in safer congressional elections. And again, I can't emphasize this enough, also support young people who are running in competitive races to defeat Republican incumbents to win Democratic majorities in state legislatures and Congress. And we can and should do both at the same time.
Yeah, I love James, but I thought your guys' debate was great. I thought his answer of just win elections is not an acceptable answer. I did like how much he, used the term jackassery, though. I thought that was maybe the highlight of that debate. I don't think I've ever heard that term besides James using it. I want to move on from this and talk a bit about the way the sort of state parties work for a second, because it's something that I got really frustrated about, having spent time in North Carolina. And I think this is actually a big issue in the sense of right now you have this situation in Democratic politics and Republican as well, where you have this every, presidential cycle, you start up these major companies where you raise billions of dollars and you kind of go from one office or two offices in a state to then, 15 storefronts, and you pay short-term rent and you underfund the state parties. And I saw it in North Carolina firsthand. Anderson Clayton is a superstar in
Amazing.
North Carolina, did
Great young
amazing
leader.
work. Great young leader. Many ways, her fight to get Allison Riggs, election certified, is going to come down to saving our country in many, many ways, and that because of how important these states are going to be when it comes to voting rights. What is your belief in how that system should change, and what can be done, and how would you, how would you change it?
Um, in terms of the presidential
Yeah,
election.
I mean, just in terms of like what can be done. I mean, we need to start having, we need to be meeting people where they are 365 days a year. And a lot of that starts from being inside these states. It also starts from meeting people
Oh,
on,
totally.
So what's
But
your take on that?
I mean, how much time do you have, Jamie? For one, guys, I think money can't solve all of our problems, but there is, I think in some ways we're spending way too much money on some things that, in particular, these consultants are way too incentivized to get us to spend money on for presidential elections, like TV ads and other things like that, where we know from, if you guys haven't looked at David Shore's like autopsy results of, what happened in this election is the closest thing that we have to an autopsy right now. He did a great interview with Ezra Klein. I highly, highly recommend it. So there's some debate over the accuracy of the data, to be honest with you, and like their methodology of analyzing it. But a lot of the findings in that match anecdotally what I have seen on the ground. A lot of them are going to be, a lot of these elections are being decided on social media. And the problem is, the voters who are deciding midterm elections are not the ones that are deciding presidential elections anymore. This idea that we can look at what will happen in Virginia, which I am pretty confident myself that we are going to win, especially with the stupidity of what Donald Trump has done with the federal government and firing so many workers. And just that people turn out to vote more in non-presidential elections that are more likely to be Democrats. I feel pretty confident about Virginia and in the midterms. What I'm really worried about, though, is we're going to get complacent when we see these special elections, when we see what happens in midterms, and we're going to say, okay, we won back the House, where everything's fine. When the voters that are deciding the presidential, they're getting their information from social media and everything like that. But I'm going on a tangent. To answer your question, Jamie, sorry about that. To answer your question, one of the places that we do need to invest a lot more money, that to his credit, Ken, I think, our chair, Ken Martin, has done a good job of, is investing more in our state parties, specifically giving them more money so that they can have more breathing room to do their actual work. One of the things that I think we really need to figure out how to do, though, is how can we make it so that every single state in this country has a paid chair and a development director and executive director? Because right now, the average term of a Democratic state party chair is 18 months. Most of them are not paid positions. And you cannot build sustainable infrastructure with that, because what you're going to get a lot of the time, to be honest with you, are people who run to become a state party chair and then use that as a platform to elevate themselves and, then run for higher office and not actually stay there for that long potentially. Or just frankly aren't able to do that good of a job because they can't afford to do that job full time, because they actually have to have a job that is a job that pays them. And I think one of the things that we could do best is make sure that we're getting way more funding earlier on in the cycle into our state elections, to help make sure that at least at minimum, all of our swing state chairs and other chairs that are potential swing states in the future are getting paid, so that we're able to build long-term infrastructure out there, which right now we're just not doing nearly enough of. I also think, Jamie, we need to figure out how we can build local parties that are more fun, that are like third spaces for our young people to hang out at, that are also more service oriented. One of the things that doesn't get talked about very much, but Jamie Harrison actually did an awesome job with, especially back when he was doing a lot more work in South Carolina, was he developed a program called South Carolina Cares, or Democrats Care, where they did a lot of volunteer work around the state, and not necessarily just overtly political, but just a lot of volunteer work to help people, to show that Democrats care about you and we're there. And I think one of the last things that I'll say that we need to do is there's a big gap in our party where a lot of people are on one of two sides. There's a lot of people who are like, okay, I'm gonna just vote and make sure I vote in every election, which is great, and we totally need to do that. But then there's other people who are like, I want to, I want to start an organization, or I want to do, something massive. When the thing is, there's a middle ground that we need to fill here, which is that if I could have everybody do one thing around the country in order to help the Democratic Party, it would be, instead of flying to Pennsylvania 2 weeks before an election from several thousand miles away to go and knock doors there and talk to people you will never see again ever in your life, probably knock doors in your own community. I would love to have a model of hyper local organizing with our local Democratic parties, where every person that is a member of that party says, all right, I'm going to become what's called a precinct captain, and I'm going to be in charge of being in touch with, between 50 and 100 people over the course of the next 2 to 4 years, and checking in with them way before an election to say, hey, I'm part of the representative of your local Democratic Party. What do you need help with? If your trash isn't getting picked up, we're going to make sure that it gets picked up. If you need to have a tree removed or whatever, if you are having, Donald Trump cut off the ability to get Social Security benefits through calling them because you literally can't call them anymore, even though that's how I think it's like 40% of claims are filed. All right, we'll help you make sure that you're able to get your benefits online by working with you through that. And then coming to them, a few months before the election saying, hey, is there anything else you need help with? This is a reminder of what we've done. And then coming to them right before the election to say, hey, this is what the Democrats are running on here. And this is who, we believe that you should support. And this is how we've taken in all the feedback that you guys have given us at a local level to ensure that you are getting the best representation possible from the Democratic Party, if that makes sense.
Totally. I love that. And I think funding state parties and state chair, the fact that that is not a well-paid position is just insane to me. And it could ultimately save so much money. Well, our results of our poll are in. The majority of the people agree with your plan to primary and incumbents here. And some people are still unsure, but you won over most of the audience. So that's a win. I want to get into messaging a bit, and especially Gen Z. It's clear that they've gotten it wrong and they continue to get it wrong. What are some of the obvious things that they should be doing and we should be doing that you think will directly speak to that demographic? Besides, which maybe is some of the biggest thing, is obviously electing leaders who speak to that demographic. But what's your prescription?
I mean, one, I'll say that there's not going to be one size fits all solution here, because unlike Republicans, we are not a cult. We don't have one person at the top of our party who says that you must believe X, Y, and Z things specifically, or else you are excommunicated. And I think that actually makes us stronger in some senses. So our message is always going to be more diverse, if you will, in the literal sense of, like, some people are going to have one message, other people are going to have a different message. I think overall, though, we need to figure out, in my view, the two main things that I think we need to focus on are talking about what are we doing to recreate the American dream, to revive the American dream for young people, that they feel, for far too many of them, they feel like it is completely unattainable for them anymore. And two, what are we doing to fight back against the corruption that has killed so many elements of that? And what are we doing as Democrats to ensure that we are building the strongest local and state and federal governments possible to actually deliver for the people and not special interests? And I think part of how, if you want examples of how I think we should start communicating this, I think one of them that is, and all of these are going to be done through social media. One of them is, his name is Chiosse, Chiosse, in New York City. She is a New York City council member, and he has a TikTok that he does where he literally goes around the city, and it's literally a series called "Why is Shit Not Working?" And he literally documents every reason why, for example, buses are not showing up on time and what they're doing to fix that in the city. Then just recently, he created I think it was last year, he created this entire TikTok talking about broker fees in New York City, something that is very unpopular, especially with young people in New York City. And he said, hey, do you guys like broker fees? Because if you don't, there's a city council meeting talking about ending broker fees in New York City and putting it more on the landlords than on the tenants. And he got several, I think it was over 1,000 people to show up at this meeting that typically has like 20 people that show up at it. And it was a line around the block. And he documented through the whole process how he was building a coalition through TikTok. He was building a coalition, documenting it on there to show how they're building a coalition to address and end broker fees in the city. And they actually did. And then he was able to claim victory with that. I think another example of what it looks like is Jeff Jackson in North Carolina. We need to utilize our attorney generals way more in the Democratic Party to show people how we are going against people that are committing acts of wage theft against employees, for example, which is one of the largest forms of theft that happens in the United States that barely gets talked about. We also need to be using them to show what we're doing to go back against, to fight back against polluters that are poisoning our water and our air. What are we doing to fight back against the price fixing that is happening all behind the scenes right now by major apartment corporations, where under current law, it is against the law for a group of companies to come together and say, okay, we all know that we're competing here. So if we want to make the most money possible, let's just all set the same price so that nobody has the option of getting something cheaper and we all benefit by not competing against each other, right? That is illegal. But there is a loophole that they have found, which is that you can come together and say, oh, we're all going to hire the same artificial intelligence company, for example, to put all of our costs into, to say how much our expenses are. And then it is going to give each one of us a most optimal price to charge for rent that coincidentally is the same across the board. So it's a legal loophole that they've used to price fix on housing. And that is one of the things that we need to combat against way more. And we need to show people too, what are we doing? Not just to address, I think we think too much just in terms of addressing the kind of demand side of things, where we try to just throw money at issues. And like, there's an important role of helping to subsidize certain things that we want and disincentivize things that we don't. But we also need to address, why isn't there enough of something in the first place? Why are there not enough doctors in the United States? When we have per capita, we have such a low rate of them compared to most other countries, which naturally is going to make the price more expensive. Why do we have so many administrators on college campuses? That is part of the reason why college has gotten substantially more expensive. Why don't we have enough housing in places like California and other blue states that is such a disaster that it's literally causing people to move from those blue states to red states? And mind you, those people are not going to remain Democrats necessarily when they get there. And even if they do, to a place like Georgia or North Carolina, they're very likely going to be gerrymandered and voter suppressed out of power. So this idea that we're just going to export voters and they're going to end up in, a red state somehow and flip the state is myopic and incredibly short-sighted. So I think that's a lot of what we have to do, is show not only why are we the less bad of two options, but more than that, why are we the best option? And I hope that in 10 years, when people hear the word Democrat, they think two things: integrity and competence. That is what I want.
Love that. You mentioned Xi, who we just put his social media in the chat. Obviously, this last election, the manosphere was talked about, the right-wing podcast hosts were talked about. Who do you think is doing it on the left, if at all anybody of interest that's either in the podcast realm or people that you think should be elevated, or is that just like a black hole that the Democrats, the progressive community needs to kind of fill?
I mean, honestly, it's important to remember that Joe Rogan was a Bernie bro. He felt like he was left by us, and regardless of whether or not we agree with him, that is something that he feels. And we've seen him waver a little bit more because of Trump's insanity around deporting, U.S. citizens or people that are legally here that are under protected status. But I think part of the challenge that we have is that last election, frankly, I think there are so many people that felt like we were for everybody but them, right? I think part of the reason why that attack ad against Kamala Harris of she's for they, them, and I'm for you worked isn't only because of, frankly, transphobia, obviously, but I think more than that, it's because people felt like we were for everybody but them in many senses. We heard from voters that the president is too old. We heard from voters that prices are too high. We heard from voters that there's an issue at the border. And to all of the concerns that they had basically across the board, we said, no, he's not. No, they aren't. Look at this graph of the G7 or some other macroeconomic figure that tells us that you should not feel the way that you do, even as your rents go up 20 or 30 or 40%. And then when it came to the border, instead of us saying, well, let's talk about the fact that there is a problem and let's ask ourselves, okay, why are people coming to the border? Oh, It's because 90% of the guns that are recovered by the Mexican military that are used by the cartel come from the United States, and we're actually fueling this crisis, and maybe we should do something about that. Instead, we said, no, there's no problem. There isn't. And unfortunately, even if the data are telling us that crime is down, even if they're telling us that the GDP is up, if people feel like crime is up and they feel unsafe and they feel like the economy is not doing good, we have to figure out how to address that and respond to it, even if that is not what the data are telling us, because also the data aren't entirely accurate a lot of the time. When we look at things like the consumer price index that measures inflation, we aren't accounting for the fact that so many people in that basket of items that's used to calculate that, how much of an impact the cost of rent went up around the country for so many of the voters that decided this election. And we aren't acknowledging the fact either that a lot of the people that are deciding these elections, or that are deciding the messaging in our party, these consultants, have become so wealthy that they have a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. And actually for them, the economy was doing great because their cost of living, as inflation went up and interest rates went down, their cost of living went down substantially, even as renters' rents skyrocketed around the country. And our response to that can't be, well, it's okay, even though your rent has gone up 30%, real mean wages have gone up 15%, when that still feels like a pay cut. And part of the challenge of what we're dealing with here, not to get extremely wonky, but I respect your all's level of intellect, and it's an important context to explain. Since the 1970s, real median wages, the average amount that a worker in the United States is earning, have gone up about 30%. So your average person is earning about 30% more than they did in the 1970s. But the problem is the cost of the essentials that they have no choice to buy have astronomically grown. In many of our cities, the cost of housing in that same time period, even as wages have gone up about 30%, the cost of housing has gone up 200 or 300%. The cost of healthcare has gone up 400%. The cost of education has gone up well over 500%. So all of these foundational building blocks of the American dream are completely out of reach for most people at this point. And our response, in my view, and our messaging can't be to say, well, let's defend democracy. Let's defend all of our institutions, when clearly we need major reform in our institutions. It doesn't mean we need to abolish the NIH and defund cancer research, for example, at all. But what it does mean is we need to address the fact that it is enormously expensive to build housing in a lot of our blue states. What it does mean is we need to address the fact that we have to use our democracy to actually deliver for people, to believe that democracy is the best system of government. Because right now, I think our young people are losing faith in the future of they're losing faith in our party, but more than that, I think they're losing faith in this country because they feel like they've been sold a lie their entire lives.
Well said. I'm going to go to one question before we finish up. Michael R. Jackson, who's a Tony-winning playwright. Michael, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Hey, Michael.
Hi, David. Nice to speak with you and hear your perspectives. I'm, I guess, an younger person. I'm older than you. And I hear you on everything that you've been saying about feeling sort of lied to and as a young person. Anyway, that's the context for my question here is I've also noticed in all these many election cycles over the years that even if Democrats sort of get back into office, what I've noticed is that they tend to say one thing and then immediately pivot to doing something else. And I think that this then creates the problems that then lead to them being kicked out of office and then having to come back and so on and so forth. And so I'm curious your thoughts about how to, assuming Democrats get the White House and the legislative branch back, how to actually hold them accountable in a sustained way beyond just getting them elected. Because I think what you said earlier is true, is that, we do have these messenger problems, and a lot of these people are very good at getting your votes, but they're less good at actually sort of being held accountable to what they promised, and also going against their own party on certain important votes in order to extract what is needed. One example being like force to vote. There was an opportunity there to get something from Nancy Pelosi, but the squad failed to do so. And I think that this is just something I'm thinking about going forward of how to actually, if you're a Democrat, to wield power in a real way and as a constituent to hold your leaders to account and force them to do what you want?
Yeah. Well, frankly, obviously I'm biased here, but I think it's having a healthy primary process for our Democrats and making sure that nobody feels like they're just entitled to be in their position of power forever. Ultimately, these seats are voters' seats. They aren't, nobody owns them by any means. And I think it's also by frankly, I think part of what enables Republicans to be one, to do what they do so well is that frankly their job it's two things. One, their job is way easier. They get elected on the idea that government sucks and then do a terrible job and prove it sucks by doing a terrible job and then get reelected by saying it sucks even more. Democrats have the hard job of making government work. And I would argue that is significantly harder than even making a business work because you have to deal with the courts, you have to deal with Congress, you have to deal with all kinds of different things that can hold you back for good reason too, right? That's part of the reason why Trump has been slowed and not doing nearly as much as he otherwise could, at least so far. And I think part of the second part of it is that we need a stronger media ecosystem that is more willing to call out the Democratic establishment when they step out of line and say, why are we not fighting harder for this? Why are we, not doing more to pass things like the PRO Act, which would have been a huge step towards growing collective bargaining power to ensure that we're growing the power of the middle class again? Why are we letting the parliamentarian of all fucking people stand in the way of a $15 minimum wage when we know that Republicans would never let that happen, right? So I think that is that's how we do it, and it's also by getting more fighters elected. When you ask people in a focus group, if the Democratic Party was an animal, I want to hear what your answers are in the chat, guys. If you ask people in a focus group, if the Democratic Party was an animal, do you guys have it? Put in the chat what you think the most common answer is.
Oh man. A teddy bear, aardvark, puppy, donkey. We're gonna leave that. A dead fish, cat, herding cats, ostrich. Okay, this is all right. What's the answer, David?
The most common answer is wait a second. What was it? It was oh, I remember. A turtle. Yeah. You know what it is for Republicans?
Lion.
Yep.
Is that right?
Yep.
Oh,
It's a lion or a shark or some other form of apex predator. I think part of our challenge is that even though we are fighting for the right things, people don't feel like we are fighting for them. And I don't get that. I think that we have the biggest issue that we have in the Democratic Party, in my opinion, well, we're not a snapping turtle, Gary, I'll say that much. The biggest issue that we have in the Democratic Party is not a cash issue. It is a courage issue. I think that we do not have nearly enough courage to take on bold fights and boldly lead on them. People are not voting for us in order to be. Americans hate diet anything. They don't want diet Republican. We see time and time again that this is not even just a policy issue for us. This is a brand issue for the Democratic Party. In states like Florida, we passed progressive ballot measures to raise the minimum wage to $15, to restore voting rights for previously convicted individuals and others by wide margins of 60% or more all the time. But yet, we continue to see Democrats not get elected there. Part of that is gerrymandering, but more than anything, it's because of a massive brand problem with the Democratic Party.
Okay, we only have a couple minutes left, so we got to be quick here. First, are there any people on Leaders We Deserve's list right now? I feel like are there people you're ready to go primary?
Right now, we are looking at candidates around the country because it's a matter of not just finding a young person who's ready to challenge somebody who's ineffective. We need to find a truly generational leader that is ready to meet this moment, that is ready to be a member of Congress, is ready to lead, and not just be a little bit better than their member of Congress is currently, but substantially better. And part of what we're waiting for, as well as, frankly, we want to see who's out there who retires, because what this is about more than anything isn't just saying to people, okay, here are the 3 things that you need to do to be considered effective in order for us not to challenge you. Because that is not the entirety of the problem. It's not like, well, you just need to show up your committee hearings, you need to do a town hall, and you need to. No, it's so much more than that. It is an attitudinal shift that we need to have in our party right now, where everybody needs to feel I think in some sense, a healthy amount of anxiety about what are we all going to do to step up to the plate more? And if we aren't able to, we should seriously consider whether or not we should seek re-election. Those members of Congress should. So right now, we have not officially announced anybody at this moment, but we are actively looking at many districts around the country.
One thing I keep saying is that I know we have a messenger problem, but I think we also have one of the deepest benches that I've ever seen in my entire life as a political activist. What's your take on some of the top party members, and also some of the lesser names out there? Is there anybody you're actually excited about?
Who do I get excited by? So let me be clear. In the DNC's bylaws, it says that we cannot be involved in presidential primaries at all. So I can't comment on anything related to the presidential primary by any means. What I will say is it's been really inspiring to see people like AOC and Bernie Sanders going out there rallying people, but it's also been inspiring to see people out there like Senator Van Hollen, who aren't just sitting on their hands saying, oh my God, we're in the minority, we can't do anything, but actually voting with their 2 feet and going to El Salvador and calling out what is happening. And I know that there's some divisions over like whether or not we should be doing that. The polling for Trump is horrible on deporting people to El Salvador. It is awful. And we also, when we lead as Democrats, what the fights that we decide to take on and who we fight for should not just be decided by polling. If we went by that notion, we never would have passed the Civil Rights Act. We never would have passed the Affordable Care Act. We never would have passed so many of the most monumental pieces of legislation that our party has passed. But that is why we are Democrats. It's because we gain power in order to use it to improve people's lives. But yeah, I would say those are some of the people that I'm most excited about, along with Ase, and Jeff Jackson. And you know, some of there's lots of great leaders around the country that are doing good work as well. But I
appreciate that. And I forgot that you can't comment on that. And I want to shout out to my Emory alumni brother, Jeff Jackson. So I appreciate you keep referencing him. Okay, last thing, I like people to finish these conversations with some sort of action, something they can do. Obviously, supporting your work at Leaders We Deserve is the #1 thing. So I'll say that for you. But what is something people could do? I always say it's critical just to do one thing every day, whether that's, reading an article or donating $1 someplace or having a conversation with a friend who you disagree with. What are some of the things you think people should leave this conversation and go do?
Honestly, I would say 2 things. One, if you really want to see part of what we need to do to improve our party, I would say join your local Democratic Party and go to a meeting and see what it's like. These things are not going to get better just by us talking about what's wrong all the time, as easy as that is. It's going to be by figuring out what do we actually need to do to improve these things. So one, check out your local Democratic Party, which I know doesn't sound like super exciting by any means. But if you're going to be talking all this much and attending things like this about the Democratic Party and what we need to do to improve, it's important to know where we currently are and what we're dealing with. And then the other thing that I would say is watch the Ezra Klein and David Shore interview for sure. It's really good. It's free. It's on YouTube, where they break down the analysis of what happened in the election, because there's some pretty surprising information in there. And then what I would say is practice having difficult conversations with people that you don't agree with. That's why I was able to have that conversation with James Carville, is because I'm used to talking to people who so vehemently disagree with me, except typically they're armed with AR-15s or, they're part of the shooting club that I was part of in college. That I think one of the biggest misconceptions that we make as Democrats is that in order to change somebody's mind, we need to instantly change their mind completely, or they need to be 100% there with us. Half the time in the conversations that I've had, as you can imagine, it's not very easy for me to have conversations with people who say, for example, that the shooting at my high school didn't happen. But by engaging in those conversations, and it's not to say that you all need to have those, but in the conversations that I've had with people like that, when I actually treat them like a human being and I'm respectful to them, and I don't engage with the same level of hatred and vitriol back at them that they throw at me, all of a sudden it shatters their worldview. And it makes them think maybe things are not as straightforward as I thought they were. And maybe my worldview isn't entirely accurate. And through a series of conversations that I've had with so many people that have disagreed with me, I've actually gotten a lot of people to agree with me. And it's because I give them the opportunity where I treat them with respect. And I say, look, I understand you don't agree with me, but let's figure out what we can agree on. And then we move forward on that. And I've had people come back to me from those conversations where it happens multiple, it's not just one conversation that changes their mind. It's many, many, many conversations over time. But I've had people come back to me that originally said that the shooting at my high school didn't happen, or that I was a paid government actor here to take everybody's guns, who since have come back to me and said, David, I was wrong. And I actually agree with you now. And that feeling is far more powerful. And that's going to be how we make progress, is creating a politics of addition where we call people in, work with them, and figure out what we can agree on to get this country back on track.
I love that. And I just, before you go, if you wouldn't mind giving us an update on some of the gun control issues. I know that we could have had another Zoom, and we should do a follow-up on where we stand in gun control. Some of these other issues are taking over one of the most important fights that you've been fighting for a long time. Are there one or two things you can kind of update us on, and in regards to that topic, that we could do?
Yes. So one, keep your guns locked. If you have them at your house, make sure that you're keeping them, away from vulnerable populations like people with mental illness or the elderly that, may have dementia, or your children, especially. And then on the policy side of things, right now, part of our challenge as Democrats is we stop a lot of bad shit from happening. And we don't get rewarded for when the bad shit doesn't happen. We don't get rewarded for the kid that doesn't starve because of SNAP benefits, for example. We don't get rewarded for the person, the family who, doesn't go bankrupt because of the safety system of the Social Security system, right? And it's the same thing with guns. We have passed a lot of gun laws around the country, including in Florida, where we passed a red flag law that's been used over 21,000 times to disarm people that risk themselves and others. And since 2021, when gun violence hit its peak over the past decade or so, this year we are on track to have about, conservatively speaking, about 30 to 40% fewer mass shootings than we did in 2021, which is nowhere near enough, but that's still progress. And we're on track to have about 25% fewer gun homicides compared to 2021 this year. And in the previous years of 2023 and 24, I'm almost done, Sarah. In the previous years of 2023 and 2024, we saw the two single largest one-year reductions in gun homicides around the country. That was spearheaded by the Office of Gun Violence Prevention that we created at the White House, that Donald Trump has since abolished, because of course he has. But there has been a lot of good progress that has been made on it. It's nowhere near enough. But we have made significant progress.
Thank you for that. I know you have to go, and I appreciate someone said using the term gun safety and not gun control. I think that's really interesting. I don't know if reframing. I want to thank you for your time. It's great to see everybody. David, keep fighting. Your best friend, James Carville, who has come around and says the DNC needs you and needs you to be the fighter you are. I know you're working around the clock for everybody, and you have your people's best interests at heart. And so just keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
David.
Thank you guys.
All right. Bye, everybody.